All right, welcome to the archive, Justin Sledge of Esoterica. Thank you for taking the time tonight to do this interview. I hope you're doing well today.
Yeah, things are good. Thank you, Garrett. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so I want to get started with talking about the actual meaning of the word esoterica.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
so yeah, go ahead.
nope, sorry, I was going to continue to ramble, so I need to stop talking and let you.
Yeah, esoterica just refers, I think, to what is suppressed or hidden or otherwise obscured in the history of religion and philosophy and history to some degree. So that's kind of what the channel that I run focuses on, are these more arcane, more mysterious, more hidden aspects of philosophy or religion. So there's what sort of is mainstream stuff, and then there are things that are a bit more under the radar, like magic and alchemy, Kabbalah, the occult. So that's typically grouped um, under the rubric of esoterica.
All right, and so I hear because I've interviewed a few people. And involved with either the studies or have some degree of participation in this in the occult. And esotericism is a word that gets tossed around. What is your definition of esotericism?
I would say that esotericism is any aspect of religion or a philosophy that's intentionally hidden from the public. So, for instance, Plato famously had teachings that he taught in public. We have those texts that he wrote that are meant to be public facing, and he also had secret teachings that he taught inside of the academy. We don't have those texts; they've been lost, and so those texts. We have an exoteric dimension of Plato's doctrine, and we have an esoteric dimension of his doctrine, which we have some idea of what it might have looked like. So it's the inward facing, secretive insider knowledge or insider dimension of a religious school or a philosophical school.
All right, thank you for thank you for answering both those questions.
Mhm.
Um, so quickly, it's been really interesting watching Esoterica because I've been watching since the early days when you did a video on necromancy,
Mhm.
and um, it gives a really unique insight to the past because you hear often, um, and it's almost kind of like in a dismissive sense from my experience, people saying, "Oh, this is a superstitious time. Those were very superstitious people." But if religion is everything, I feel like it gives a different depth to history, not just like, ooh, how did they view ghosts? What did they think dragons were capable of doing? But I feel like it really gives different clarity on the everyday life of our ancestors.
Yeah, I think that one man's religion is another man's superstition, and vice versa. I think that I mean, no one self-identifies as superstitious in a lot of ways. I mean, maybe ironically now, but superstition and like the word magic was always used as an othering term. It was people doing religion badly or incorrectly. And so, it's not the kind of term I would use. But yeah, I think that by studying these more esoteric dimensions of religion and spirituality, we do get a glimpse often into what common people did. So, for instance, often if we find magical texts, people will say, well, that's forbidden. They're not supposed to be doing that. Well, so says the bishop. But we actually get a glimpse of what people actually did as opposed to what they were supposed to be doing, whatever that is. Um, and it's by looking at some of these magical texts that have been recovered from Europe and the Middle East and other places that we get a good glimpse into what religious practice looked like on the ground, probably more likely for common people, as opposed to the officially sanctioned version of whatever religion people are supposed to be doing. So yeah, I think that often these esoteric dimensions have an ironic effect, where on the one hand they're hidden and suppressed, and yet on the other hand they actually tell us a great deal about what's going on the ground.
Does it add or does it change the perspective a little bit as well when you're looking at the history of one's own religion?
I think it shows you that but the vision of history we often have is incredibly simplistic. And we all suffer from the survival bias. We assume that all Christians look like Thomas Aquinas because when we want to learn about medieval Christianity, we go read Thomas Aquinas. Well, Thomas Aquinas is not the end all be all of 13th century Christianity, 13th century Catholicism. And so we shouldn't expect that Thomas is the end all be all. What we should expect is a more complicated scenario, just like now. I mean, go to a church and poll people in secret about what they really believe, and I'm sure you'll get a range of beliefs. So, just in the same way that people's beliefs are complicated now, they were often complicated then, and people were much less conformist than you might believe. We typically think of the Middle Ages as a highly conformist society, but that certainly wasn't the case intellectually or politically, or peasant rebellions all the time and all kinds of things. So unsurprisingly, right, you have massive peasant rebellions, you're also going to have rebel disaffected exorcists out there summoning demons to find buried treasure or whatever they're up to.
All right. And so what is just quickly what's so far your personal favorite story or your favorite person that you've studied so far in the history of esotericism?
Interesting. I guess. I mean, there's a lot of different characters, and they're all characters, so they're really interesting to study. I mean, Agrippa is a really interesting guy. He's a doctor and a lawyer and a esotericist and a skeptic and a mercenary. He's just sort of. I mean, he's just one of these guys that needs to have like a Netflix series about him already. So Agrippa is a really fascinating guy in that way. Of course, I've worked a lot with John Dee. John Dee is also one of these characters that's very interesting because he's deeply Christian, but also pushing the limits of what would be considered Orthodox Christianity. He's deeply scientifically minded, and he wrote the preface for the first English edition of Euclid's Elements. But he's also like knee deep in what we would recognize as angel magic. So he's a fascinating character just because he seems to live in several worlds. And I think that's what's to me the most fascinating thing about a lot of these esotericists is because they're keeping some aspect of what they're doing secret, they kind of live in several worlds. And having done that, it makes for a very rich attitude in personal life. And, often they get in trouble. So that's often good, juicy drama. Um, I think maybe from antiquity, I'm really interested in Zosimus of Panopolis. He was an alchemist operating in the late classical world, who managed to combine Neoplatonism and alchemical practice. And he came out of the Egyptian priesthood, but he's writing in Greek. And so he gives us again this sort of glimpse into several worlds where on the one hand he's operating in a very technical alchemical world, but at the same time he sees it as part of a spiritual practice as well. He's relatively unique in that way in the ancient world. He has some knowledge of the Egyptian priesthood and its secrets, but also he's a technical guy writing in Greek. So someone like Zosimus of Panopolis, I think, is also a very fascinating and little known character, I think.
You think do you think too when you're looking at these lesser known characters in history, do you think you're helping to add to the studies?
One hopes. I mean, history is history. It's a big mess, and so just because we don't learn about this stuff in high school classes or college classes doesn't make it, one, not history. Of course, it's history, and also two, it doesn't make it not important. And I think a lot of these characters and a lot of the books they wrote, and of course things like the witch trials, and those of course massively important historical events in the history of jurisprudence and what have you. So yeah, I think that the task of something like what I do is to say, yeah, sure, we can talk about Duns Scotus, we can talk about Thomas Aquinas, we can talk about all that, and we should, and we need to learn all about that. But also, we need to learn about these other more heterodox characters sort of lurking in the shadows, because they were also part of a connected web of intellectual development. That, again, for history's sake, it matters. Completeness is a aspirational goal when telling history.
Yeah. Okay. And this is something that um, fascinates. This is one of my favorite subjects to study when talking about magic. Is also the magic within the Abrahamic faiths, like when you were just mentioning a moment ago, angel magic. Um, to me, I feel like it was just something that was always there until roughly the Inquisitional period, and this is just to the best of my research. Um, and I'm not nearly as skilled or as knowledgeable as yourself, as much as I wish I had the time and the ability to be able to research these figures and have access to their books and be able to read the languages as well. Like when you read Latin in Isaac Newton's Emerald Tablet Latin writing, which is an awesome video. You should definitely look that up if you don't know what I'm talking about. And
Okay.
so, um, was there was this something that like dwindled off during kind of like that 1600s period, or went into secret, or was something that people that lost interest in?
Um, I'll say that in the Jewish and Christian worlds, communicating and dealing with angels and demons has been basically something they've been doing since the very beginning. Again, um, Jesus, for instance, if he weren't known as the Messiah, he'd been known as a pretty popular exorcist. Almost half his miracles are exorcisms. So the idea is that if you can cast out demons, you can summon them and get them to do things for you. Did it with angels. There's a long tradition of angel magic, both in Judaism and Christianity, that I don't know that it went underground. Certainly, the Inquisition didn't destroy it. They certainly tried to arrest John Dee, and it didn't work to lure him to Rome so they could arrest him. But yeah, I mean, people like William Blake and Swedenborg, those guys are interacting with divine beings all the way up into the 18th century. And of course, I think you would say that it transitioned in some ways. And the Enlightenment happened, and obviously that shifted the intellectual environment of the world. But no, I think that Christians have been working with angels continuously since there's been a Christianity. Judaism also, there are very complicated systems of angel magic that exist also in Judaism. So certainly for those two Abrahamic faiths, I would say that there's been a continuous history of that, either attempting to get angels to reveal secrets to you, or harnessing demonic power for various kinds of ends. There's a range of ends. So yeah, I would say that it's existed the entire time. Um, I'm not sure that it's ever been totally above ground or above board, but pretty consistently practiced.
Okay. Yeah, because weirdly for me, I just feel like there was just a point where Christianity just tried to kind of toss that word out entirely and say, "Oh no, we're praying. We're not using magic," even though it's by definition what they're doing. Um,
And depends on your definition of magic. I mean, Christianity, like all religions, has always had to kind of um, there's an official what you're supposed to do, right? Go directly to God through prayer, and then there's people doing other things. And so, whether that's asking for the intercession of Mary, which is a very magical kind of trait, or the intercession of the saints, or something like that, or direct intercession with angels and demons. So, yeah, this is but there's always been a line. I mean, if you read the ninth book of The City of God by Augustine, Augustine lays out a very systematic, basically becomes a standard version of what the official church teaches about this stuff. And so, yeah, Christianity has always had, and to a less degree, Judaism has always had a very tense relationship with what exactly to do with magic.
Magic.
Um, yeah, and again, it depends on what you consider magic, right? Is attempting to get angels to give you information magic? Is praying for a saint to help you get married magic? It's this um, what at what level is folk religion crossover into magic?
Yeah.
Um,
And
so there's a
quickly,
there's a range of things here.
what from your studies is your definition of magic?
This is the $50,000 question. No one has a really great definition of magic. I would typically think of magic as like it is something like illicit supernatural causation. So illicit typically, because magic is almost always an othering term. It never refers to what you're supposed to be doing. And supernatural causation, it's just a means of affecting the world through non-natural means. So But of course, that's a bad definition because it does include natural magic, which is a big part of Renaissance magic. So I think of the magic like as a term, a bit like Gnosticism. I look at these kinds of categories. Is that the higher resolution that term is, the better it describes a specific set of practices, but it doesn't leave out everything else. And the lower resolution the term is, the more it describes, but it becomes very messy about, like, it describes them very poorly. So I don't think that there's ever going to be a great singular definition of magic. In fact, there's a book behind me that I don't know if you can see it. That's just a 300-page long attempt by 24 scholars to give definitions of magic, and it's a mess. It's a methodological minefield.
All right. Well, thank you. I always, every time I run into somebody who studies this, I always try to hear what their definition is. I find that it overall is um, all the definitions roughly mean the same thing,
Yeah,
or everybody's kind of pointing at the same thing.
it's like Augustine said, right? Everyone knows what time is until someone asks you what time is, and you don't. It's everyone knows what magic is until you have to get in front of a camera and say, "What do you think it is?" And like I said, I gave a definition and immediately had to backpedal on
No worries. I'll pardon you on it.
it.
It's 8:30 at night. You had to
It
put
could
the
it could
kids
it
to
could be
bed.
8 in the morning, and I could be full of coffee, and everything could be fine. I would still have to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just it's a task in the impossible, unfortunately.
Yeah. So there's also kind of quickly, I'm not gonna call it backpedaling, sidestepping, I guess, or stepping over to different subject. There's a couple of things in magic that I see come up. Um, Kabbalah. I have heard a lot of people talk about that, and then when you get into the more spiritualist or spirituality related conspiracy theories, um, they really love tossing cabal or Kabbalah around. And just like asking you what is magic, I'm going to ask you what is the cabal or the Kabbalah? Because this is something that is often talked about a lot, but I have not heard a definition for it yet.
So the Kabbalah is three things. The first thing that it is a form of mystical speculation that emerged in basically in the 13th century and among Jewish scholars. It's a form of mystical interpretation of reality and the practices associated with that. So the Kabbalah is that tradition of developing that theosophical stuff with divine emanations, the Sphirot, and all that. Primarily developed in the 13th century, really wanted a renovation in the 16th century, and has been developing ever since. So that's the first thing that it is. That's traditional Kabbalah, spelled with a K. Um, in the 15th century, late 15th century, Christians got really interested in the Kabbalah, and they specifically in Italy, and wanted these texts translated to Latin so they could read them. And so that started a form of Christian Kabbalah, spelled with a C. And that Christian Kabbalah argued that inside of the Jewish Kabbalah, there was proof for the truths of Christianity, things like the Trinity. And so this would form a new form of Kabbalah, distinctly Christian, with Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin and John Dee and Agrippa and people like that. Um, so there's that. In the 19th century, late 19th century, there was a system of what is called Hermetic Kabbalah with a Q. And that system is basically an attempt to take various forms of esoteric symbolism, specifically the Sphirot and the Tarot, and then map that system onto other course via correspondence to other kind of esoteric systems all over the world, like the I Ching and things like that. So this is a system developed primarily in the European occult milieu of the late 19th century, and it's basically a system of correspondences built on primarily tarot and tarot cards and the Sphirot, which were developed in Judaism way back in the 13th century. So there are three things. Kabbalah is those three things. But typically, when I use the word Kabbalah, I would refer to specifically the Jewish traditional Kabbalah, and then specify Christian Kabbalah or Hermetic Kabbalah to make it clear what I'm talking about.
And now that you've thrown in the lovely word hermetic, could you also define that for me, for the audience too?
Yeah, so Hermeticism refers to the theoretical and practical knowledge attributed to the legendary sage Hermes Trismegistus, who was a sort of antediluvian sage who, depending on the story you want to read, he taught Moses and all kinds of stuff. And so there are technical works associated with Hermes Trismegistus. There's be works primarily on alchemy and astrology. And then there are philosophical works. These are referred to as the Corpus Hermeticum and the Asclepius. And those are more like spiritual philosophy or philosophical spirituality, depending on how you want to cut it up. And those were actually composed primarily beginning in the sometime the third century and developing after that. So you have tons and tons of Hermetic literature ascribed to Hermes Trismegistus, both so philosophically astrological texts and a bunch of alchemical texts. The most famous, of course, being the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus.
Okay. All right. Thank you for those answers. Now, there's something also that fascinates me, and it's from what I've found best is it's called the Seal of God,
Mhm.
and it's multiple stars and writings, and the name of the other shapes are escaping me right now. But there's a five-pointed star in the center of it. And I'm curious behind that, because the five-pointed star has always, from what I've seen, has been the protective symbol of the witch for witches. And I'm curious to know if there's a story behind that symbol.
If I'm thinking of the right one, this is the seal of God associated with Dr. John Dee. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yes.
Yeah. So the sigil, the sigil of truth is what I think he calls it. So this was an image revealed to Dr. Dee via the scryer Edward Kelly, beginning in the 1580s, I think it was, in the early period of their attempting to contact angels. So basically, what you have is an image, a sort of seal of God that would be impressed upon wax, and then you would use that device basically as a modality by which to contact angels, like the angel Michael or Uriel or excuse me, what have you. But the five-pointed star, I don't think it really becomes associated with witches and witchcraft until, or Satanism for that matter, until the 20th century. It's a relatively recent addition to that. In fact, all geometry was basically thought of as divine because it was part of the orderliness of God's world, and so all geometric shapes were thought of as a expression of the orderliness and the reasonableness of God. And so you see lots of protective sigils with the five-pointed star, and it's I think only with the Church of Satan that they invert it to show, to be edgy or whatever. Um, so I think it's only really develops then. But no, geometry throughout history was always thought of as a unique witness to the perfection of God's mind or whatever. So, but that image particularly was painstakingly revealed. The seal of truth was painstakingly revealed to Dee and Kelly over the course of several months. I think a better part of a year, and it's full of all kinds of numbers and names of God and names of angels and all manner of strange and unusual things.
All right. Maybe there'll be a future video on that and John D.
Yeah, there. I'm going to do a video eventually on the what's called the heptarchic system. That's the system of angel magic and angel and planetary magic that was revealed to Dee early on before the so-called Enochian language was revealed to him. So it's sort of the precursor to that system of magic, and it actually looks a lot more like planetary spiritual magic you would find in the Middle Ages.
All right. So my last two questions. Um, what have you personally walked away with from studying all of this?
Strange dreams. Um, Not as strange as you might think. I come away. I'm not a believer in that. In this stuff. I'm not a practitioner. I'm not an occultist myself. So I haven't come away with any desire to want to practice any of this stuff or anything like that. I think what I've come away with mostly is an appreciation for the complexity of history, and two, a real appreciation for the sense of awe that these texts inspire. Because I think most of us walk through life, um, kind of seeing what we believe in, what we see. And if you put yourself in the shoes of these occultists and esotericists, which is what I basically do as my job, the world gets really complicated and much richer because there's an entire world of things you don't see, spirits and angels and demons and all kinds of things. And so I think that by putting myself into their shoes, it allows my imagination to work a little harder. And because I want to present them as sympathetically as I can, I don't have any interest in, throwing them under the bus or making fun of them or whatever. And so cultivating a sense of awe, I think, is really come away for me. It's part of what I've come away with, because when you put yourself in the shoes of people who are surrounded by the supernatural at all times, you get some kind of like contact high with their sense of awe. And so I think I've come away with a sense that the world could be very different than I think it is. One, and two, yeah, it comes away with a bit somewhat more, what's the right word? Uncanny. The world seems a bit more uncanny. And I think when the world seems a bit more uncanny, we're much more open to experiences of awe and the ability to ask deep and profound questions about what is constitutive of reality.
Yeah. It is kind of interesting when after trying to like read up as much as possible about my ancestry in Ireland, um, and here in Maine where it gets really cold. Um, it's interesting when the season shifts and those first nights when it's finally cold enough to the point to where you can hear the trees creak.
Hmm.
um, it's a unique experience too to hear those strange sounds and then try to put yourself in the shoes, or try to for me to put myself in the shoes of my ancestors who may have thought, not that that's a tree creaking, but that could be a spirit of the woods talking or
Hmm.
something of that nature.
No, I totally agree. I feel the same way about the first time we have a wood stove in our home. And so, yeah, Michigan, it gets pretty cold, not as cold as you guys. But that first night in October, we have to light the wood stove, and the crackle of the wood, and there is something, primitive is not the right word, and or if it is the right word, I mean primitive in the best possible sense, where you're really connecting to primordial technology. Like for the first fires I make, I always make them with the flint and steel, and there's something about seeing the spark, fly off, and you start a fire from flint and steel. There's something very ancient about that. And ditto, I think about my ancestors in Lithuania way back in Middle Ages, where the cold beating down on them, and the nights getting darker, and for them the world's inhabited by all kinds of ruchot and shadim and demons and all kinds of things like that. So yeah, I try to cultivate a sense of respect for these forms of knowledge, and it's also a good check on me. Just because I believe what I believe doesn't mean they're not wrong. So I try to maintain an open mind,
Yeah,
a skeptical attitude, and an open mind, and a sympathetic eye.
yeah, I feel like that's a good perspective to have.
Hope so.
And yeah, and the last question is, what message would you have for future generations?
I guess I would say that um, we owe it to history to tell history well. I mean, people went through enormous challenges to develop alchemy and develop these techniques of magic. And it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter whether we believe in them or not. But we have a sacred duty uh, to the people who've come before us to present to history what they believed and why they believed it, and to give them a fair shake, and not to make fun of them, and not to dismiss them as superstition and throw them under the historical bus. That's an arrogant attitude that assumes that we have it all figured out, and I know damn well we don't. And by turning to history, one grasps the depths and complexity of the past, and I think it's only then that one can realize that whatever solutions we can offer for the present and the future will not be simple. because it's never been simple. I think of William Faulkner, who's a Southerner like me, who said that the past isn't dead; it's not even past. And so, insofar as the past isn't dead and not even past, then we owe it to the past and we owe it to ourselves to get the history right. And that means really studying the nooks and crannies of history and the strange and unusual books that we've inherited and form part of our intellectual and philosophical and spiritual heritage. We owe it to those people that did that work to study them, and we owe it to ourselves to understand it well, and we owe it to the future generations to have done our part to do that work.
All right. Thank you, Justin.
Of course. Thank you, Garrett. Thank you.